We're going to now introduce our second panel for today, which is the DeFi Stack for today and tomorrow. Our moderator for today is Dan Robinson with Paradigm, along with speakers from speakers such as Stani from Aave, Amir from 0x, Sergey from Chainlink, and Zubin from Opyn. So I will pass it off to Dan.
Hey, everyone. We'll wait for a couple more of the people from the next panel to join. We're going to be talking about the DeFi Stack today and tomorrow with these founders. Hey, Zubin?
Hey, John. Wait, can you hear me? Hello?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Cool.
Everyone can hear you.
Yeah.
All right. So actually, while we wait for the rest of the panel to join, why don't we get started with having you two introduce yourselves. So Zubin and Sergey, if you tell us a little about your projects and then how you personally and what they do in DeFi and how you personally came into DeFi. Zubin, if you want to start.
Yeah, so I am Zubin from Opyn. We are building decentralized options on Ethereum, working very closely with Dan and the Paradigm team. And how I got into DeFi is a kind of long story. I would say that I am like a big finance nerd from when I was really small. When I was like in 5th grade, I wrote like my book report on like the stock market. And I was like trading stocks in middle school. And I actually was like trading through the financial crisis, even though I was like really small. And just seeing the opacity of like derivatives markets and seeing how no one really knew what they were holding and these like flows of like value and with many intermediaries was able to like topple the entire global economy. And from a young age, I felt there's something wrong in that story. And when I discovered DeFi in college, when I was at Berkeley, or rather than I say discovered DeFi, I discovered like Ethereum. DeFi wasn't even a term back then. I was like, this is the fundamental technology that takes out those intermediaries, makes it much less opaque. This is like the fundamental building blocks for a more inclusive, more open, more transparent financial system, and fully programmatic financial system. So at that point, I got fully nerd sniped and have been working on it for the last 4 years, working on DeFi related stuff.
That's great. How about you, Sergey?
Sure. So Chainlink is an open source platform that creates decentralized services, such as the provision of price data to DeFi, randomness to gaming, automation for various types of hybrid smart contracts. So it's a lot of different services that uses, these advanced decentralized Oracle networks to create a form of trust minimized off-chain computation that enables smart contracts, to extend to more industries, more useful use cases, really just provide more usefulness to people. I've been in the blockchain industry for over 10 years now, building smart contracts for 7, approaching 8, kind of as long as you can be building those. For me, DeFi is part of a long movie. It's kind of a section of the movie. It's a very exciting section because it's smart contracts going beyond just tokenization. It's using the output of tokenization and the value created by it to create a useful financial products. And some of the things in DeFi, depending on if you consider insurance in DeFi, don't even use tokens, right? So it's fulfilling the vision of smart contracts in a way that is beyond tokenization. So for me, it's very exciting because, blockchains are the future of how the world is going to secure all information and value, in my opinion. And this is financial information and value, which is very important and is a logical starting point. For me, DeFi is kind of like the e-commerce of our industry. Tokenization's kind of like email, and DAOs are kind of like chat clients. So e-commerce is good, basically. It made the internet what it is. DeFi's the blockchain industry's e-commerce. It's gonna change what this whole place is about. It is already changing.
Very cool. And I think we've had Amir join us from 0x. Amir, you want to introduce yourself and your project?
Yep. Thanks, Dan. So I'm Amir, co-founder, co-CEO of ZeroX Labs. You can think of ZeroX as exchange infrastructure for the internet, and that itself consists of a few different components. One of them is it is a settlement layer for peer-to-peer trades. One user can trade with another user in a completely non-custodial and trustless way. And that typically happens, using either order books or our request for quote system. And the second big piece is that ZeroX aggregates liquidity across all the different decentralized exchange protocols out there, across a few different blockchains at this point. And typically those are automated market makers in some form. I think overall there are like 40 to 50 different liquidity sources that kind of plug into ZeroX, and users don't really need to understand any of them or worry about where their liquidity is coming from. They're just going to get the best price regardless. Before starting ZeroX in 2016, I worked at a few different prop trading firms, and kind of just got fascinated with the cryptocurrency space. Watching like the first big Bitcoin run up, back in that day as a trader. It was just very interesting to see this new asset class, and started to learn about it. Really fell down the rabbit hole. When Ethereum came out, and I started to understand like the capabilities of smart contracts. It just became clear to me that this was the future. Back in those days, it was very early. Not much infrastructure was built at all. I think people understood that the technology was really high potential, but didn't know exactly what it was going to be used for. The term DeFi did not yet exist. But one thing we were really confident of is that anything of value that could be represented digitally will eventually become tokenized on a public blockchain. Smart contracts are just going to enable really interesting new interactions between value. And if that was kind of the end state of the world, we knew that people were going to need to be able to trade these things. So that's how we came up with the idea for ZeroX.
Great. I'm moderating this session. Dan Robinson. I'm a research partner and head of research at Paradigm, which is a crypto asset investment firm. But I should say that I'm here representing my own views and not those of the firm, and nothing that I say on this, of course, is investment advice. So I wanted to ask for this crowd, I think we've seen a lot of really interesting innovation in DeFi. What's one thing we've seen come out of DeFi that you think might have a broader application, for example, in traditional finance? What's one concrete innovation that we've seen that you think will end up having wider usage?
Well,
I'm happy to go.
All right.
Zubin, go ahead.
All right, got it. So what do I think will have broader usage? There's a lot of things. I mean, it was interesting. Rune was on the previous chat in this room, and I think one thing is synthetic assets. So not just like synthetics, the platform, but broadly like the idea of like DAI, right? Being able to like transmute any one type of value into a different type of value, right? Like DAI is the dollar with an oracle plus ETH, right? And so that means that you use any oracle plus any piece of value to transmute into any other type of value. And synthetic assets to some extent exist in TradFi, but I think like the ability to just go from like any arbitrary piece of value to any other arbitrary piece of like tokenized value this easily with just an oracle is like an incredibly powerful use case that I think will become very interesting with time.
Cool. Mary?
I think for me, arguably the biggest innovation and value proposition of DeFi is just permissionless access to liquidity. Whether that's like for exchanging assets or for borrowing assets. I think it's just a really powerful concept. You have all these different pockets of liquidity on the blockchain, and you can kind of mix and match them together and do whatever you want. I think aggregation is like, one of the easiest to understand examples of that. But you can also you can just stack these things in pretty arbitrary ways. So you can like borrow from one protocol and then exchange that asset in another protocol, and developers can just build interesting new applications, and they don't really need to manage that liquidity at all. It's almost as if it's a public good. I think like an analogy in kind of the traditional finance world would be, if like every single exchange, bank, and financial institution had an open API, and anyone can interact with these, but they don't need to actually trust these institutions, or give custody of their assets to these institutions. They could just tap into them and use them for their end functionality. And yeah, I mean, we're kind of starting to see the beginning phases of people mixing these money Legos together, but I think we're going to see many more interesting things online.
Cool.
Yeah, so I think that the ability to get yield is quite powerful, and really the global financial system is just a bunch of people seeking yield, right? Different types of yield, return to combat inflation, to create a return, to diversify while getting yield, right? So in that sense, lending protocols such as Aave, I think, are very impressive in that they make this permissionless infrastructure immediately useful to both people in developed markets that are trying to combat inflation, right? Because the percentages you get from these lending protocols are anywhere from like 3 to 8%, even on fiat, right? On fiat that's put into them somehow. That's quite impressive, and I think is going to become even more important as inflation makes people want to preserve purchasing power to an extreme degree. And then beyond that, in emerging markets, you have a permissionless lending infrastructure, or you have a way to make like a bank account with yield for anybody, as long as you make an interface that converts their value into the value going into that protocol, right? So, and I know Aave and others are expanding pretty rapidly to a number of these types of use cases. So it's really impressive that you have something that generates yield from a blockchain-based environment. That yield is higher than the yield in developed financial markets. It's more accessible and easier to build around in emerging markets, and it's more transparent, which allows arguably much better risk management in both of those markets, right? That's kind of an amazing outcome for any financial product that anybody ever would make. And I'm seeing it in front of my eyes, right? So that's very impressive to me. And I think that'll continue to be impressive. Inflation, all these things will just make that more and more in demand.
To ask the converse question, what's something that traditional finance has that hasn't yet been built in DeFi and that you think needs to be?
Oh, so if we just start with, yeah, okay, great.
Sure.
I think identity. Identity is important because it allows a certain class of liquidity and value to flow into DeFi. Regardless of how people feel about identity systems or the pseudonymous nature of blockchains or those benefits and how that affects the permissionless nature of them and so on, which I have my own views on. The reality is that there's huge amounts of value that are tied to identity. And there are requirements that institutions and other places with a lot of value have that are basically gated by identity, right? And once identity is layered into the blockchain environment, then you can meet all kinds of requirements for getting that value from institutions into these protocols. Because I don't think the institutions are going to want to reinvent the protocols, just like they don't want to make their own blockchain. They're not going to want to make their own protocols. They're just going to want the benefit of blockchains through the protocols, but they're going to have the requirement of identity. That's actually something we're working on. We have a number of identity oracles that already allow people to meet certain identity requirements if they want to put institutional level value into DeFi protocols. So that's the thing that I think TradeFi has and DeFi doesn't have. But once DeFi has that, I think the floodgates will kind of open for certain classes of value that are being held back by having an ability to provide compliance and therefore the value that they want to put into DeFi.
How are you, Zubin?
This is a really good question. I think there's like 100 different things I could say. But if you really look at like DeFi today, there's a lot of ape stuff going on, right? And I think that there's a whole class of incredibly powerful like hedging insurance type technology that like really I'm excited to see flourish and like bloom in DeFi, right? So there's so much risk off like technology that exists in TradFi that is incredibly rich and helpful and useful, but DeFi is still like yet to make serious, I think like yet to make serious innovation or headway there. So that's probably what I'm most excited about. That's when DeFi goes from being like what it is now to being like a fully fledged financial system that can be used for pretty much all use cases. I think like Sergey mentioned, everyone wants yield, and that's definitely true. Everyone in DeFi wants yield, and that's a natural incentive. I think also everyone wants fundamentally, or people are okay to give up a little bit of that yield to protect their downside, to tail hedge. And I think like a lot of Talebian type views of like anti-fragility and having portfolios that are like very robust to volatility. Those are like more increasingly popular in TradFi. And I think that's when like DeFi like really just like becomes the whole thing. So that's what I'm very excited about.
Anything to add, Amir?
Yeah, I actually completely agree with Zubin. From my experience, like most of the liquidity providers and market makers on decentralized exchanges today are either not hedging their positions at all, or they're still hedging on like centralized venues where they can access more complex and capital efficient instruments. It's primarily spot trading on DeFi today, and I think maybe the missing ingredient for that transition to happen, for those hedging instruments to become widely used on chain, is just like increase in speed, throughput, and latency of the underlying blockchain. I mean, we're definitely like on the cusp of some very big improvements. We're starting to see many layer 2 solutions and side chains roll out, and they're getting pretty good usage. But I would say there's still like more infrastructure that needs to be built to kind of tie everything together, package it up for like mass consumers or institutions to use and feel comfortable using. Ethereum over the last year has went through some pretty big periods of congestion, and it's hard to like trade options, for example, when you have to pay like $100 in transaction fees just to put on the trade. But I think we'll get there like pretty soon, like probably within like the next 6 months. I think these things are going to be in a much better spot, and yeah, it'll be interesting to see liquidity providers actually starting to use them, and like we can start to see price discovery actually happening on DeFi first rather than the other way around.
Well, is there something that each of you think you don't want replicated from traditional finance that we haven't seen yet and that you hope doesn't come over?
I think Jerome Powell being able to print all the monies is probably something I don't want on chain. I'm being facetious. I think there is definitely a lot of very intelligent people working on the Fed and working on these problems. I do have a mindset that like to the extent that you can stay maximally robust and decentralized, I think that's really good. I have concerns that the current Federal Reserve banking system is like incentive compatible. It seems to me that like the incentive is always towards like inflation or towards like overprinting of assets, and I feel that programmatic limiting of that is very powerful on chain. So I would say that I think that insofar as we can keep innovating on alternatives in terms of robust and hard money, I think that's something I want to like keep, you know, DeFi native or crypto native as long as we can.
Cool. Sergey?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a fundamental benefit from blockchains in that they force transparency and they give people certain assurances about the trust assumptions that they have when they're using a financial product. And those trust assumptions are based on a number of things around how blockchains inherently work and how they do things like order transactions, how they handle reorgs, how they provide finality, all these types of things. I think what I wouldn't want is I wouldn't want asymmetrically larger actors with larger budgets to be able to somehow manipulate underlying infrastructure to effectively take money from weaker, smaller actors, because that would collapse the trust and transparency assumptions of blockchains generally. So that's a concerning thing for me. Like, I don't want to replicate HFT world in blockchain world, because, you know, to the degree that we can, that's a very difficult problem, you know, because people have asymmetric information, people have different speeds, maybe something with how blockchains inherently work, but there's a, you know, a fundamental kind of difference in that transparency and those guarantees that I think should be somehow maintained. So as long as blockchains guarantee transparency and certain trust assumptions, I think they'll be uniquely valuable. If they stop guaranteeing those to all participants for some set of reasons, regardless what the set of reasons are, it becomes like HFT land 2.0, which is not sufficiently different, in my opinion. So that's the general thing that I would be concerned about. But you know, to the degree that we as a group of people building all of these things can solve that.
Sergey, I had a question. What is your reaction to what we're seeing on in like MEV, Flashbots, and I don't know if you were following the whole like reorg software saga. What would be your reaction to that? Because to me, that seems a lot like HFT stuff just being like replicated on chain.
Yeah, so I mean, earlier on in the life cycle of blockchains, everyone was talking about them as an experiment. Everybody was like worried that they were not going to maintain their security like maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And everybody was qualifying all of their statements with like, blockchains are an experiment. Don't take it so seriously. It's just a couple of $100 million in the system. Right now it's like trillions of dollars, and people are probably like, look, when things start going a little weird, people are like, it was an experiment, right? Like, at the end of the day, this is all pretty new technology, and it's trying to solve very difficult coordination problems in a very public way, in a way that traditional secure systems don't, right? Traditional secure systems hide everything behind a firewall and hope no one gets through the firewall. And this stuff is like imagine if Visa's infrastructure was just open to screw with, right? Like, God knows what we'd be able to do with it, right? So I think all of these things are part of like the learning curve of us as a community of people that want to make this infrastructure do what we set out for it to do. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. I think there are these types of blips. You know, those blips happen. I think they eventually get solved in some way. There's some kind of mitigation that gets put into, you know, the blockchain protocol itself, or in some method, I think, or some layer 2 solution. I think so far some of this stuff has actually lowered gas costs. So it has a positive effect in that sense, and that makes the system more scalable and easier to adopt. I think in the medium term, it's a question of how it'll impact people's trust in the system. And I think in the longer term, it has to all get depressed to a commoditized, low cost, practically no cost portion of how the system works. Because if people can asymmetrically like manipulate it to make money, we could be back in HFT land. And like the real question is, how much can that happen? And some people say it can't happen at all, and some people say it can happen a lot. And it's a fascinating debate that I don't have enough time to do the detailed research on at the moment. But that's the general idea. Hopefully that answers your question.
And to add to that, like, you know, I think generally the risks in blockchain technology are much more transparent. Actually, they're, you know, pretty much completely transparent, but they are much more difficult to understand for your average person as well. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. But with the whole MEV crisis going on right now, I think at least one of the good things coming out of it is that everybody can see what's happening, and people are trying to figure out like how to actually address these issues. It's not just like this opaque problem that will continue to go on for the next 10 years or whatever.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That's very impressive. That's very impressive in that like people know this is the problem. There's a lot of smart people looking at it within like weeks or months of it appearing. It's really thoughtful in that sense. So that's a great point.
All right. Thank you guys so much for discussing the DeFi stack for today and tomorrow.